Welcome back. Before we move on, there's an exciting feature in Node that I'd like to introduce you to. We're talking about worker threads. This is a built-in module that enables the use of threads to execute JavaScript in parallel. Worker threads are useful for performing CPU-intensive JavaScript operations. Those operations that would otherwise block our code. Whoa. I know what you're thinking. Doesn't our JavaScript code run on a single thread? Was everything that we learned earlier in the course wrong? Don't worry. Everything that we've learned so far very much applies. Worker threads don't change how Node works at the core. But they do add something new. Worker threads take Node just one step closer to making JavaScript a multi-threaded language. But not exactly. JavaScript, the language, doesn't have multi-threading features, and that won't change anytime soon. So what's the difference between traditional multi-threading and worker threads in Node? What exactly do worker threads do? To understand this, we need to look at the bigger picture. Worker threads in Node are based on the web workers that are available in your browser with the Web Worker API. Web workers let you run a piece of JavaScript code from your browser in, that's right, a worker thread. But in Node, they're a more recent feature. A feature that's still evolving as we speak. Worker threads were introduced thanks to a shiny new feature of the V8 engine called V8 isolates. V8 isolates are isolated instances of the V8 engine. You can think of them as these sandboxes that run JavaScript code independently of each other. Worker threads use these isolates to create new threads that can execute your JavaScript code side by side, with each V8 isolate handling the JavaScript code for one thread. What this means for us in practice is that worker threads, just like clusters, help us to take advantage of the multiple CPU processors in our machine. So worker threads are similar to the cluster module, but they do things very differently. The cluster module uses processes, while worker threads use this V8 isolate. Why does this matter? How does this difference affect us as developers? Let's explore these questions by comparing how the two work. To recap, our cluster module allows us to start a server which creates a master process that can then use the fork function to create child processes or worker processes, which can do things like respond to requests in your server. And you can call fork however many times you like to create new workers. We're very familiar with this flow. In comparison with worker threads, when we run our JavaScript file, we create what's called the main thread. This thread can use the worker constructor to create a new worker thread by calling new on the worker constructor. And just like with the fork function, we can create as many workers as we'd like. If this seems very similar to you, that's because it is. If we look at them side by side, the flow to create worker threads and processes follows the same structure. Basically, you can think of the cluster module as allowing us to run multiple instances of Node in separate processes, while the worker thread module allows us to run multiple instances of Node in the same process. By taking advantage of that V8 isolate feature that we mentioned. We'll see this whole flow in action when we write some code to take advantage of worker threads. There's also some very important functional differences between worker threads and clusters. If you're paying really close attention, you might have noticed that with the worker thread example, I'm not calling my JavaScript file server.js, but instead index.js. This is to highlight the difference that each worker thread here is not designed to share requests coming into a server. The worker threads module doesn't include any built-in functionality to run a server on one port and distribute incoming requests between each thread. No, that's specific to the cluster module. So we could run a server using worker threads, but we'd have to implement that distribution of work ourselves. And here's the main difference. Unlike processes made with the cluster module, worker threads can share memory between each other. We'll see this in action in the next video. For now, what we need to know is that the worker thread approach isn't as rock solid as the cluster approach with multiple processes. This cluster approach, which has been used in Node since pretty much the day that it was created. In production, I highly recommend you stick with clustering for your servers. But that's what makes worker threads so exciting. There's still a lot of potential behind how they can be used, and it's definitely an area to watch out for. On that note, let's find out how to use worker threads in the next video. I'll see you soon.